and welcome all. This is Dr. Mallory James, ready to tell you about writing literature reviews for interdisciplinary research. My lecture today has 2 chapters. First, I will give you a vision of success, describing what a successful literature review may look like within your master's thesis, journal article, or nonfiction professional report in interdisciplinary social science. Second, I will describe 5 concrete activities you can take to advance your literature reviewing project, especially if you feel stuck within the process and need to hear a few tangible, experience-tested next steps. Let's start with a quiz. Assuming you have a notepad open, order these 5 shown options from most to least important as the functions of a literature review within a professional text. Write down the number sequence corresponding from the most to least important functions, and we will return to this at the end of the lecture. Okay, let's start with a success definition, because if we name the goal and dwell for a moment on what your final product should probably look like at the moment that you submit the MA thesis, then we should be better prepared to get into the inner workings of how to achieve that goal. The term literature review refers to both process or activity and product or outcome. Its intangible goal is to assess what has been written on your topic before you, and by doing so, build upon and relate your work to existing literature. In brief, the purpose is to find your argumentative niche. You do this by offering multiple kinds of information I will discuss. The exact page count for a literature review subsection of the final MA thesis depends on the nature of the MA project. If you need to know exactly how many pages your specific advisor hopes to see, do ask them, but be prepared that the advisor may groan about this question or try to avoid it. As I have written before in my capacity as an MA advisor, I believe that if I give you a specific list of what exactly counts as a good project, then I'm limiting your project to a definition of success I already had in mind before I even met you, which I don't want to do because I instead want you to do better than me, accept what I can offer, and move beyond it. I believe that to some extent, giving you, the student, precise specifications would prevent the emergence of novelty in the world, work that only you can do. Nevertheless, I work in a department that expects 20,000 to 30,000 words for an MA thesis in science, technology, and society. And I tend to tell the students that this should take between 4 and 20 pages, depending on how much space it takes to achieve the work that a literature review should achieve. If you're writing for a particular journal, your goal is something comparable to whatever is currently done within that journal. Ultimately, professional academic authors are relativists in practice. We change our voices and the formal shape of our speech to match the conversation or journal in which we seek to participate. If you already know you would like to publish your MA or a manuscript derived from it, there are numerous references available about how to interpret and match the standards of a specific academic journal. One is clearly the submission page on the journal's website. Another is Week 4, Selecting a Journal, which is a chapter of Wendy Belcher's book, Writing Your Journal Article in 12 Weeks. So either for the article or for the MA submitted internally, your literature review will probably have between 2 and 5 subsections or chapters. These categories will become evident to you later, rather than earlier in the process, because building these categories requires immersing yourself in the detailed textures of your unique intellectual project, actually reading what comes back from your literature searches, and pondering whether you do or do not agree with the author's choices, and why. So to put a fine point on it, the 2 to 5 subsections that appear in your final manuscript are the outputs of your work, not pre-existing categories. More soon on how to achieve them. So to sketch this image of success, possible organizational strategies governing these 2 to 5 subcategories could be topic by topic, subfield by subfield, issue by issue, or perhaps chronology of the conversation in the literature, although I don't necessarily encourage this one. I don't encourage chronology as the structural spine of a literature review because students who choose that then necessarily run the risk of including way more literature than is technically needed to set up the problem for the MA thesis. So chronology has these inbuilt risks. In any case, remember that each subsection should relate to the research question of your MA. Remember that your literature review does not merely describe the existence of prior literature, but goes beyond that. It shapes its description of existing research towards staging a need for your work. It makes a case for your project as the logical next step, or at least a logical next step, to contribute to the development of academic knowledge in this area. So here are a few things that the literature review is not. It's not an annotated bibliography. It's not a list of sources. It's not a summary of source lists. It's not a merely descriptive commentary on the background of your topic. And it's definitely not a discussion of everything known about every topic your work touches upon. Instead, think selective. In persuasive nonfiction writing, information about what other researchers have achieved is a raw material from which you can build a case for the significance and relevance of your own work. So this is important and perhaps easy to say, but not easy to do. Addressing how to use other people's work in this way is part of the substance of this lecture. So written literature review. It situates your work methodologically, epistemologically, and within the larger context of an academic community. Your literature review produces an evidence-based argument about why your work is important as something that should be done right now. So by the time you're at the stage of the final written outcome, you'll be conveying a lot of information to your reader about yourself and your project, including your judgments of who is worthwhile to cite. In doing so, you are telling the reader who you are intellectually and why you matter. To some extent, you do this by citation. Citation is social because each source is a person, and you are permitted and encouraged to have and perform a qualitatively different relationship with each of the different sources you choose to cite. So more on this community aspect. Especially in the introduction to your manuscript, citation is a way of signaling who your friends are, or scholars you are putting yourself into conversation with, even if you don't know the people you're citing, and hence they're not your friends in a real sense. They're still your people intellectually, and by citing them in the introduction, you can do, as Professor Joao Biel once told me, gather them around you. Gather your people around you in the introduction to build legitimacy for yourself. You can also politely disagree with some of them to build originality and relevance for yourself. If done successfully, this will make your work sound significant and relevant to your reading audience. Now moving on to what should appear in the document body. Your efforts in literature reviewing there will be both summarizing what was learned from the prior research that relates to your topic, and also subtly suggesting that the story isn't over, hence building more of a case for the value of your new work. But that community orientedness I've just dwelt upon, it can be fine-tuned as you revise and rewrite. In the meantime, remember that literature reviewing is an activity, and in that activity, you're finding and giving basic topical information about the worldly issue under study, prior theoretically related knowledge in STS and anthropology, and ethnographic and historical background that really fleshes out your MA topic in its geographic setting. The outputs of this activity, to get this basic topical information, prior theoretically related knowledge, and ethnographic and historical background, won't only be confined to one section of your manuscript, but instead it will affect every other part of your project. The written output will achieve many different forms of intellectual work for you. different advisors and different authors and journals have different ways of bundling these forms of work together, or even superimposing them on top of each other in the same manuscript section, as in the journal Cultural Anthropology, or instead parsing them out and separating them into different document subsections. But overall, since I'm talking to you about persuasive nonfiction generally, the outputs from literature reviewing are particularly likely to show up in 3 places in the final manuscript: the introduction, the literature review chapters, and the findings, discussion, or conclusion section, in which you will dance between the themes emerging from your analysis and the implications of those themes for existing ongoing conversations and projects. Indeed, there should be mirroring and transformative repetition between the literature review early on and the discussion or conclusion section later on. Both of them address the so-called gaps in knowledge. Both of them narrate a story of prior research you want to contribute to, and both present the context of the debate. But the difference is that where the introduction sets up the gaps, the conclusion actively puts your own new results into the context of the debate and offers a natural conclusion to the introduction and literature review that came earlier. Let's pause for a moment over my word choice for the so-called gap in knowledge, as I'm referring to it. The activities of finding literature, writing about it, citing it, and turning to your own new contributions upon its foundation are ultimately about knowledge production, or to phrase it more modestly, knowledge change. At the very least, I hope that you are at least changing your own knowledge about the topic by doing this work. And as per the title, we are talking about interdisciplinary research. So, it's entirely possible that some of you may be receiving different and potentially contradictory advice about literature reviews from different sources in your community. So these divergences in the advice that you're getting, I contend that they may originate from different assumptions about the nature of knowledge change in social science. For lack of better terms, let's call these assumptions positivist and constructivist. Working in a positivist intellectual universe, answers are either right or wrong, grounded in an epistemology that seeks laws and facts, perhaps by testing hypotheses, probably by working with clearly defined objects and predefined concepts that don't change across the course of the study. So such a universe may use the gap in knowledge metaphor to denote missing facts against the backdrop of a single unitary wall of knowledge. When MA projects are assigned and evaluated within a relatively more positivist intellectual universe, then we see a terminology appearing, such as state of science/theory, that presents the paper's theoretical framework as fused with the kinds of background factual information that underpins the paper. And we also see theory and/or background facts visibly separated from the rest of the MA, performing the mandates, we could say, of an epistemology that requires evidence to be clearly separated from interpretations. Think lab reports, in which your findings and your discussion must be kept apart. That's about the nature of the universe in which the work is being done. As you know, a positivist approach is not the only one that you can encounter in social science. And positivist thinking collapses some of the differentiations that humanistic, interpretive, or non-positivist social science sees fit to preserve, such as the possibility that two different academic communities may know different or even incompatible truths about the same object, situation, or topic. So in a constructivist epistemology, as articulated by sociologist Andrew Abbott and nonfiction writing expert Larry McInerney, knowledge becomes authoritative when it is judged as authoritative and true by a set of scholars who are socially and politically important enough that what they say becomes taken as the conversation defining an academic field or subfield at a particular point in time. This is an epistemology that grounds scientific authority upon social authority in a way that's ultimately arbitrary, insofar as Andrew Abbott acknowledges, scholars change fields, and what counts as a body of work depends on the vantage point from which the boundaries around that object are drawn. But why do you care in the context of literature reviewing? How did this content about divergent concepts of knowledge change get into this lecture on literature reviewing? You care because in science, technology, and society studies, from whence I'm reporting to you here, we inherit both from positivist scholarship and also from humanistic and literary epistemologies. Epistemologies that seek not laws but meanings, channeling Clifford Geertz. Our intellectual community in STS includes those whose knowledge moves and grows in what could be called positivist ways, as well as those who believe that form matters. The presentation of information counts as information. Literary and artistic scholars would believe that as well. And hence we include scholars who combine evidence and interpretations together in the same paragraph or subsection, as well as scholars who want to parse them out into different subsections. Okay, theoretical digression aside, I'm now going to move to offer you some more expansive ways to locate yourself while literature reviewing. Ways to use the same metaphor of gap in knowledge that make it constructivist rather than positivist in practice. So what we're doing now is you can think of the state of science that you're supposed to be reviewing as white light that you can break into its colors while trying to figure out what information to put where in the written output of your work. My proposition to you is literature review sections actually perform two tasks. These two tasks can be your guide point for how to judge what you find and what to do with it. So as written by Professor Susan Gall, the May and Sidney G. Metzel Distinguished Service Professor of Anthropology, Linguistics, and Social Sciences in the College at University of Chicago, on an internal training document regarding anthropological proposal writing distributed in 2010, she says, there are at least two kinds of literature review in a qualitative research project: ethnographic or historical background and theoretical or conceptual issues. Each of these connects you in somewhat different ways to earlier work on the same or similar topics. In each case, your job is to show the intertextual links between your research and previous work. Another way to say this: how does your work enter into and transform the current conversation? So that is as written in 2010. I personally do not give my advisees concrete rules about how to combine or separate these two categories of intellectual work, where to locate them in the document, or what subtitles to put them under. But I would suggest that together your presentation of both kinds of literature review, both ethnographic and historical background and conceptual and theoretical issues, should be more than 4 but less than 20 pages, as I said earlier. And I will now discuss each of these two subsets of information type in turn, then move on to the practical tips and 5 activities. In ethnographic and historical background, you claim the opportunity to be selective and only present those aspects of prior ethnography and history that relate to your puzzle in your MA as defined by your research question. One might ask, what is known about the features of the research site, the social and political groups acting there, the organizations and institutional forms in play, the cultural projects underway there? Can you, as Professor Gall puts it, link your specific field location to regional, national, and perhaps even broader scales of description, especially if these are likely to be relevant to your theoretical approach? As she also says, you will have to mention previous work, historical, ethnographic, sometimes journalistic, on this locale or site. Be sure to consider the position from which you undertake this description, locating yourself in a field of others who have written about the site. My interpretation of this is you can distance yourself from previous descriptions or take the voice of previous descriptions, You can argue with them politely. That's all a range of things to do other than just reporting the facts that they consider factual. Present this information in such a way that your research questions appear to be a natural curiosity that arises organically from thinking about your project. In adapting and adding to Professor Gall's definition of ethnographic and historical background, I'm aware that perhaps a geographically specific territorialization of your project feels less relevant to you personally in your research. Maybe you're mentally switching out the words locale or site or location with topic in some general way, not geographically linked. But in any case, I'd like to warn you that just because you believe your topic is deterritorialized does not mean that other scholars may agree. Other scholars may expect to see geographically related background knowledge as crucial to understanding your topic, so do prepare for that. Writing this type of literature review may set you up to describe other units than the ones you are using. Be sure to attend in your thinking to what are your units that you are assuming. It is in the interaction between units of analysis important to you as the new MA writer and units of analysis important to the other scholars doing work whose outputs create the environment for your current work, that the unexpected interactions and logics and mappings create the new qualitative project. Students have asked me, is describing the STS concept for my paper part of the literature review for my paper? Is the theoretical approach just another subsection of the literature review? So that brings me to the second type of information, conceptual and theoretical background. My response to this repeated question is yes, describing conceptual and theoretical background is a second kind of task for a qualitative research project, but I predict that it may be done with a lighter touch for an MA project as opposed to a dissertation project or a book-length work. A course paper may work with just one concept. An MA does, to some extent, carry the burden of demonstrating links to the history and current state of theory in your field. For this task, you do have some responsibility to locate your project and approach in a field of other research. So how to do this? Given that you know that your STS concept is indeed part of your literature review, how to take care of this? Well, one way is to locate or diagnose the puzzle in your project as an instance of one or more theoretical issues in your research field. By this, I mean scaling up. What you're looking at is just one instance of a theoretical problem that other scholars have studied around the world. Let me make this concrete for you. I have supervised a master's thesis on household technology use in Nigeria in the STS department. The student writer was very concerned that there was no prior STS research on household technologies in Nigeria. This is a case where the puzzle of the project, so the theoretical issues underpinning the person's particular questions, although not studied in the geographic site the person was taking on, had indeed been looked at elsewhere in the world. So basically, this is scaling out of the puzzle at hand into other people's work. So in terms of what's a puzzle for social science generally, well, I'll give you some examples. Citizenship, nationalism, subject formation, theory of history, memory, knowledge production, ethnic or racial differentiation, power dynamics, social movements. These are all interests that are studied on a theoretical level. And they are part of how you are making a creative theoretical contribution by bringing this theoretical interest together with empirical, ethnographic, and historical material, and of course, the empirical case of your particular MA. So you can find a way to position your novel contribution by returning to your specific project, stating how and why the study of your puzzle is meaningful in relation to existing theoretical knowledge. Theory contributes to you, and your work contributes to theory, at least potentially. The extent to which your thesis or dissertation must do this definitely depends on your department and your advisor. What is the difference between finding a gap in knowledge and staging one? You may be wondering about my word choice for staging a gap in knowledge. As specified, in a constructivist theory of knowledge change, we consider knowledge as located within a community. So, shown here, we have a community of cats at the theater. This is to remind you to think of your audience. You need to show all these cats some puzzle, some drama, some so-called gap in knowledge. You're presenting the knowledge gap as if it exists without you, but in practice, you're creating it and also implying the forms of evidence that can enter into answering it. Think of yourself as directing the play, marching out the specific characters one by one, creating the story which the audience will receive. As Larry McInerney would say, you are also building the problem into your readers. So, good writers anticipate and plan for reader doubt, but great writers actively create, channel, and shape reader doubts in such a way that the emotional force of that doubt becomes part of the active personal connection that gets forged between the reader and the text. In summary, by this word choice around staging a gap in knowledge, I remind you that the raw material discovered by your literature review becomes part of the intellectual problem presented in your manuscript's introduction. And since motivational introductions is a different topic, I will refer you to Joseph Williams' book in 2013, pages 114 to 116. So now, I'd like to offer concrete activities that fall under the umbrella of literature reviewing, 5 tasks on which to spend your time. To do number 1, keywords. Make your topic and question into keywords. Remembering those 2 kinds of information I said the literature review is accountable for. In picking keywords, here's something to think about. Being laser focused on your topic and only your topic is not necessarily a virtue in interpretive social science. In a constructivist mode, I ask you to remember that what you consider your topic is a specific conceptual hypothesis, a specific framing of events and people, which empirical study through interviews, etc., and or additional reading may force you to change. What I mean is, all topics and their related terminology form part of a history that has to be accounted for. Conceptual objects such as epigenetics, startups, carbon capture and storage technology, etc., these are historically specific framings of phenomena. So, if you just take this one word and keyword search for it, problems will emerge. Your project, if it is hyper-focused in the sense of only wanting to read prior literature that explicitly mentions your conceptual object or explicit topic, it's going to be over-focused and insufficiently contextualized in the prior knowledge you can draw on and relate to. The project that is hyper-focused could turn out to be a boring project in the end, whereas, on the other hand, a project that is under-focused could be impossible to finish in a timely manner and hard for outsiders to comprehend and build upon the results of. So the too broad project, no one will cite it because they don't know what to take out of it to make into their own citation of that work. Cultivate openness, but not infinitely so. Your search for keywords may require a thesaurus. Many of them are free online. Get a more experienced researcher in your field to listen to your draft keywords in comparison-contrast to your research question and topic, and suggest other keywords that can help produce an interface through related concepts and what your field considers synonyms in order to find prior scholarship. Now that you have some keywords, pick a journal that you know is in your field and do some keyword searches within it, both looking for the ethnographic and historical information and also for potentially theoretically relevant information. Play with annotated bibliographies for the results that come back from your searches. As you read and take notes, continuously ask yourself, how would I categorize this work? What else have I read that is similar to this? The structure and categories that you eventually use in your literature review will arise from the literature itself in an inductive process if you are continuously questioning your own categories as you add to them. If you keep producing these relationships across the project, then at the end point of your process, you'll be able to simply write down the logic underpinning your category, which you've already thought through, and this writing will count as a description of the literature according to your unique analytical viewpoint. Okay, the second concrete activity to take. Snowballing through bibliographies. If you find a great source, definitely work through its bibliography and see what other great sources may be waiting there. There are a lot of new software tools such as Sitemap and the cited by function within Google Scholar that will help you find the network of academic professionals that produce the research you're reading and the network that has been produced, strengthened, or continued onwards by the research you're reading. So both the network that went into the work and the network that created itself out of the work. Furthermore, as of 2024, when I record this, conference programs for important conferences in your field are typically now online, even for those of us who didn't register for a particular conference. So if you know the name and affiliation of a specific researcher in your field, whom your current MA project or your article really resonates with or has highly influenced the questions you want to ask or the ways in which you ask them, absolutely go see what panels this person has presented on and which co-authors they have worked with for those presentations. People who write together and speak together are highly likely to be operating within a shared intellectual community that could also include great other reading suggestions relevant to the construction of that community's knowledge. It's entirely possible that prior research that addresses your empirical and conceptual interests in the descriptive, open-ended form of these conceptual interests may have taken place outside of your field, outside of STS in this case, but instead in the disciplines that contributed to creating your field. Ancestor disciplines like sociology, anthropology, history, and maybe even management research, to the extent that it's done in a way that looks methodologically similar to STS research. So, yes, you can make those decisions on a case-by-case basis. And as I've mentioned, snowballing through bibliographies is the tactic that I use the most. Now, let's take a moment to think through the judgment process you'll have to go through after a result comes back. It is essential to reflect on what you aim to do with the citation you're bringing into your manuscript. Rather than have general criteria to use on every reference, no matter what purpose you plan to use that reference for, instead, you need to reflect on what you will do with that citation you're bringing into your manuscript. So, general criteria, as listed on the slide, include relevance to your research question, authority of the text for the field in which you're getting your MA or the journal you're seeking to publish in, and timeliness. Timeliness is interesting because it looks quite different if you are writing to and about and within a community that is book-oriented or a community that is article-oriented. Scholarly books often retain their authority and relevance longer than articles do, so perhaps your goal for MA should be to use both books and articles. A source you choose to use should be appropriate to the claim that you are making in the context of a given citation. For example, you could cite news articles in some cases, but this would be more appropriate in certain parts of your manuscript rather than others. Perhaps news articles can be used to document events that occurred or ways in which events were discussed or represented. But don't use news as the source of authoritative facts regarding culture or ethnographic or historical information around your site, because news articles are not produced by practitioners held to the standards of making that kind of information and transmitting it to you. Reading while intending to write. I'm sure that you have been influenced by many intellectual ancestors in the course of this degree program that you're in, or your larger background. You have been influenced by many people. You do not need to cite them all. Do not cite every scholar who caused you to become the researcher you are today. Only cite those who are absolutely necessary to set up and define the current project of the specific manuscript you're writing. As mentioned, think of citation as an active, deliberate practice of naming and claiming the specific ancestors who empower and enable this specific project for you. Reflect upon your inclusion and exclusion criteria, publication date, methodology, theoretical affinity. Keep a private record of your approaches to conducting searches. Don't describe your process for searching for literature in your document because your readers probably don't want to know that. However, keep a record of it because while you're undergoing peer review or critique and conversation with your advisor, you may have to defend those choices. While reading, continuously think about how your new discoveries relate to your prior discoveries. So when you find something that sounds important, ask yourself, where should I put this? What does this connect to? A significant benefit of the digital notes files we use today is that it's easier than it ever was with paper to move chunks of information around and to never stop moving them until the moment at which you submit something or finish a task and start up a new project instead. So your chosen software, even a simple Google document or Word document, will let you continuously place information near to what it's related to. Don't feel bad about picking simple software. When you do that, you save yourself the burden of having to export and import your information from software to software when one of them reaches the end of its free subscription cycle and goes to a paid model, or when one of them stops being supported by its provider. Every time you work with your private reading notes file, it will hopefully have slightly better categories in it. So in summary, your process looks like finding information, judging what it's related to, then adjusting your category system to better account for what's in the category. And this is your way of producing new categories. If you remember just one thing from this entire talk, please remember that the categories are the output of your thought process and discovery process, not its input. As Professor Golub at the University of Hawaii wrote whilst reviewing some work by Andrew Abbott on research method, life, after all, is like a huge coffee plantation, perhaps one left fallow and running wild, and our articles about it are like espresso, distilled, highly processed condensations of the real thing. The fourth concrete tactic you can take for literature reviewing is finding a model text. This works because there are as many ways of connecting your findings from literature to your own personal research as there are authors. I'll say that again differently. There is no best practice for literature reviewing because the activity of literature reviewing is reinvented by every author who undergoes it. So to save yourself from the chaos of this multiplicity, pick a model article from your target journal or perhaps by your MA advisor that will show an example of a good intellectual performance in staging and creating a gap in knowledge and a niche for your manuscript's new argument. Once you found it, have a look to see how many subcategories your model's text literature review uses, and what kind of subtopics the author has selected for their literature review. By sets of topic, or subfields of research, or some other means of division? How does this model manuscript gather together, or divide and parse apart, the different kinds of intellectual work conducted in literature review. Students have asked me, what exactly can I learn from a model once I have identified it? And there's a more subtle answer. I invite you to think about what relationship you see between the claims about the prior literature and the evidence drawn from it by that author. For example, look at the paragraphs in the text. Does the scholar use several long blocks of citation per paragraph? Do they ignore dealing with the style and the form of the prior works in order to extract only the facts from the prior works? Or, in contrast, do they care about the attitude that the prior cited authors took towards their material? Perhaps they cite fewer works per paragraph in order to linger more over the qualitative texture of the prior texts. Basically, your model will model the use of other literature. If you like the model strategy of staging reviewed literature, and if this model is not your specific MA advisor or a text from the journal you're targeting, then ask your supervisor to discuss the model with you and see if they also resonate with the writerly approach being demonstrated there. The last to-do and tactic for literature reviewing is to get peer feedback and potentially create a writing group of your peers. One of the barriers to writing is excessive reading. At some point, you must stop reading and start writing. Peer writing groups can help. They impose deadlines for when to share partial drafts with each other for peer feedback. They can afterwards check whether your work and your process seems to be aligning with the genre conventions they also are trying to learn in your field, or what needs to change. Peers, in my experience, can be very good for increasing your word count. They can point out where something you have written in a single sentence that seems perfectly clear to you actually needs a few additional sentences to make it clear to an outsider, hence increasing your word count. So we are now drawing to an end to this lecture. Don't get lost in a self-assigned mandate to non-selectively describe the contents of other sciences' knowledge. Instead, search out our journals and presses, where our means the community in which you are trying to work. Be judicious about what you choose to keep and how you use it. If your literature review findings cannot connect to the purposes of your MA project, do not cite them, even if you read them. Instead, find new or different ones. But if you feel that you have mapped out the conversations and the knowledge that relate to your research question within your self-assigned borders and within the intellectual universe of the field in which you're seeking a degree, great. You probably have a solid draft. Definitely move on and get some peer feedback on that. Now, returning to the pre-lecture quiz, let's review how we would vote on what is the most important function of a literature review. The answer that I give to this activity is 4-3-1-5-2. So for number 4, think of that as the argument of the lecture I have just delivered. Number 3 is also a good answer, because as I've said, citation is a social practice. It shows the resonance and the interconnectedness, hence also the shared legitimacy and authority between you and an academic community. Now, let's think about those other answers that I do not suggest are important functions. Regarding number 1, hopefully we are writing texts that have a broader audience than just the authors whom we cite. Yet I nevertheless acknowledge that citing people is one way of calling for their attention and hence achieving a specific and durable impact with a tightly defined academic community. So that's sort of moderate. Regarding number 5, writing long rambling texts is a really good way to lose readers' attention, cause them to basically close that browser tab and no longer wish to hear the outputs of your work. Literature reviews are not meant to provide evidence that you've done a lot of reading. They are not meant to be summaries. A summary instead is something you write for yourself and keep it private. Keep your reading notes private and only release in your final MA or manuscript the information that readers need in order to believe that an argumentative niche exists for the particular document. And regarding number 2, we are not always writing texts that are meant to spur action. Some texts that we write are just meant to change the way a situation is perceived or conceptualized. This is the distinction between a practical and a conceptual problem. If you don't understand this distinction well, I highly recommend a chapter called Motivation, pages 115 to 116 of Joseph Williams' book, Style, the Basics of Clarity and Grace. It will define the difference between practical and conceptual problems. Okay, thank you for your attention. This is Dr. Mallory James, and I have addressed how to write literature reviews for interdisciplinary research. Good luck with your projects.